All right, I am excited today because a lot of people ask me questions about selling internationally on Amazon, and I'm an American based. Well, I'm an American based in America, selling internationally, and I have someone who's from the other side of the pond to talk a little bit about selling internationally, as well as just what he's seeing from a global perspective, what's working selling on Amazon in the U.S. Because I think it's also interesting that people are looking from outside of the U.S. in as to what's working here and abroad. So I'm super excited to have with me here today someone who runs a mastermind. So he's got a lot of international players in the space that he's communicating with. He's also the host of the amazing FBA podcast. Michael Veazey, thank you so much for being here today on Maximizing E-commerce.
My pleasure. Great to be here. And it's very nice to be the interviewee rather than the interviewer. Very relaxing, I hope.
Yes. Yeah, it always is fun being on the other side of the coin when you're not having to worry about okay, what question do I ask next? How's this question going to come across? So you just kind of just roll with it. Yeah, it's definitely fun. And I have to say, for those listening from the U.S., are probably all like, "Oh wow, he's got an accent." So where's that accent from?
Well, I'm originally from the west of England. If I talk like where I come from, I sound a bit more like an American accent was originally from that part of the world, apparently. But that's
Oh,
not
okay.
normally how I speak. So I'm from Gloucester, which is in the West Country, where quite a few people, like the Mayflower guys, came from the southwest, I believe, of
Okay.
England. But yeah, I live in London now, so I guess I got a bit of a Londonish accent, a little bit. But yeah, English
Nice.
anyway. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, we here in the States love the English accent, which is crazy. But anyway, you and I were talking offline the other day about why is that? Whereas I'm sure the American accent is probably intriguing for people in the UK.
Absolutely. I think it's kind of associated with two things: the film industry, and in my case, I guess the internet marketing industry
Mm,
in general, Amazon in particular. It's mostly dominated by Americans. So quite a few Brits these days, but they're not so visible. They're quietly beavering away, making a lot of money. Who are the guys that I know? So I'm happy to
gotcha.
share
Gotcha.
those guys' insights with you.
Gotcha. Well, looking forward to it. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the whole selling on Amazon world or e-commerce, however you want to put it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because actually, the other day I was thinking about this because I bumped into somebody who got into it the same way I did at the same time, and I was thinking it's very easy to kind of overlook these things or make them fit a neat pattern. But the truth is, I think there's a clue here, a big clue for where things are going with Amazon marketing. I was part of a group of people who sort of mini tribe, if you like, and the guy who ran it at the time, since moved on to other things, called it his tribe with a capital T, and that was his big thing. And there was
Mm,
a bunch of coaches and consultants, and he was helping them market themselves. And at that point, I was trying to kind of half trying, not very effectively, I have to say, to make a bit of a splash as a singing coach, which is something I occasionally still do, is keep my hands in.
okay,
But
that's
I never
interesting.
really, yeah, I never really did much with that. And then for whatever reason, I guess it's because a mixture of dollar signs and it was genuinely the coming thing. Basically, he and his business partner got this group of several hundred coaches and pitched them into ASM3, so one of the early internet marketing things that deal with Amazon.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha. The amazing selling machine, I
that's
think it
right. Yeah, I was going to
was.
say I was
Yeah.
avoiding saying it. I suddenly thought, oh no, I'm product placement, but I'm not endorsing them
Right.
or saying anything against them either, in case their lawyers are listening. But yeah, that's
Oh,
what
gotcha.
we
Yeah,
got
we're not
into.
saying anything either way.
No, so there are about 300 people from that set of people that got sold into that, and I think the motivation of the coach was partly because Amazon was a big, growing trend and the next opportunity in the internet space, in the way that so niche sites and Google had been back in 2005. This was back in 2013, 14, and also they saw the dollar signs and the commissions. To be honest, so I think it was a good mixture of good and bad reasons that people got pitched into it. But I was just thinking about this the other day because rather than
Mhm.
hide that, I think hello, influence is the next big thing. Now, people who have a group of people that they have influence over is just huge. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen in the mastermind in the Amazon space, ironically enough. So I've just made a sort of connection with two things in the last couple of days when I was reflecting on it, that
Mm.
actually the reason I bought into the Amazon space is the same reason that you could sell people into buying your products, which is I was persuaded by somebody who was an authority figure to me, plus the sort of group of people around me. So I had social proof. So that's how I got into it.
Gotcha. So, did you start off selling in the U.S. or in the UK?
I did. I started selling in the US partly because the training was US based and based with US guys. And I've got to say,
Mm,
without their lawyers getting in touch, that they were very good at the marketing and they were okay at the product research based on the time it was back in 2014. You could be quite aggressive in what you went for. They
gotcha.
had no idea at all about how to source products from China because I guess the guys who created the course had basically focused on stuff you have made in the US, mostly supplements and that kind of thing. So that was a sharp learning curve because it didn't really cover that.
Hmm.
And I had to learn basically from scratch and research a lot. But that was also something that prompted me to create my very first, what I would laughingly now call a mastermind, meaning a bunch of people who don't know much, but are trying to get somewhere. And what I realized is most people don't do anything. After a few months, it became very evident that my fellow sellers and I was booking a meeting room and running the meetings and stuff for free, basically. And I realized that most of them weren't doing anything. And actually, I gradually did get to the point where I did order some product from China and I got selling within a few months. And my first product went live in the 30th of November, 2014. I remember the date because I sold one unit to myself just to see if it worked.
Oh
And it
wow.
did. And then, thank goodness, somebody else the next day bought something. I thought,
Right.
wow, crazy, this might just work. And that's when I got launched.
Nice, nice, nice. Yeah, I think today, like even if you try to like buy it yourself, Amazon would probably flag you. But that's not. It's not. It's nice that you're able to do it. But isn't it like the best feeling when you realize someone else bought your product?
Absolutely. I mean, they say, I think it's true. They say your first sale is the one you remember. I do. I
Hmm.
remember the date. I don't remember the other dates, particularly in relation to Amazon selling, but that one.
Oh yeah, definitely. I remember my first sale, and it was a retail arbitrage thing, and I just like went nuts. I was like, I can't believe I've done this. This is real, because you kind of think like, oh, you just hear stories about people that do it. Like, yeah, that's not like real. Then you realize, oh wow, this really is real. You can get someone somewhere else and just figure out how to scale it and go from there. All right, good. So you got yourself up and running. You ended up selling in the U.S., importing from China. Did you end up going into the UK?
Absolutely. Went into the UK, I guess about a year later, a year, 18 months,
Mm.
and then went into Germany and the rest of Europe, but primarily Germany. In terms of the sales volume, it was more important than the other European countries, but it wasn't very hard to expand into all of them. Yeah, it went there about year and a half later.
Yeah, and that's the nice thing about Europe is that you can start with the UK as a base of operations and go into the rest of them. Yeah, and it's
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
hard part is translating and making sure it's a reliable translation.
Yeah, I'm lucky in that I speak fluent German and my French is okay. So I
Oh
was
wow.
able to deal with that. I mean, Italian and Spanish, I don't really speak, but
Hmm.
that meant that I could do the work myself. I mean, other people, outsource it now, but I have to say, one of the mastermind members has made a healthy, so probably over $500,000 dollars, well north of $500,000 a year in Germany, based on, I believe, some very good keyword research and some pretty horrible translations. So I wouldn't
Mm,
advocate that to anyone. I would say if
right.
you're going to do it, get in touch with some translators. But yeah, you don't always have to be perfect and spot on with the actual words. If your imagery is spot on and the price is right and the product's good, I guess. But don't do this at home. I mean, it's probably also better to do it better because I'm always looking at that guy and thinking, yeah, but you could add another few 100,000 if you did it properly. So I better go and bully him about that in January. Actually, now I
Right,
think about
right.
it.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is that, there's less competition in the foreign markets than there are in the US. So that makes it, easier to go in. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily as a long-term solution copying and pasting your listings into Google Translate and putting them into some of the foreign markets. But in some ways that's even better than having nothing at all, because at least
Well,
you can
it's like
start getting some data.
absolutely. Like, it's like a business coach of mine, Dan Bradbury, used to say, look, imperfect action beats perfect inaction every time. So there's your
Absolutely.
tweetable for the day. So, I mean, in other words,
There you go.
and I'm giving credit where it's due. It's not my words, but yeah, it's better to go into Germany with a horrible Google translation, but decent keyword research than to not do it at all,
Hmm.
unless you're going to really mess up your brand. But as long as you don't say something inaccurate that's going to get you rude reviews or something, or break some regulations, okay, caveat. But for the
Right.
lawyers listening, but yeah, on the other hand, if you're going to do it, once you've tested it, I would move fairly rapidly to doing it properly. At least it's 80-20 everything, right? So if you've got 100 SKUs, probably find the top 10, maybe top 20 are doing
Hmm.
most of your revenue and even more of your profit. Then you might as well optimize those first. But I wouldn't just neglect it because that seems a bit tragic to me. And that is one of the problems you have when you have a scaling business. You can't do everything. So
That's true. That's true. You can't do everything. There's only so much time. But after a while, if you start looking, okay, what are the little things I could do along the way? Those little things add up over time. And sometimes I even get frustrated from the day to day. It's like feel like nothing's like moving the needle. But then you look back over the course of several months, and you're like, oh, actually, there was quite a bit of stuff that happened there, and it did move the
yeah,
needle.
I think the key with moving into Europe is if you're basing your stock in the UK, and you could do that whether you're American or British. If you're British, then the VAT implications are nicer because you don't have to. You're starting out now. If you're talking about some startups, the VAT you don't have to register for VAT if you're British until you hit £85,000, so about $100,000 plus per year in turnover. And if you don't store your stock in the European countries, then you don't have to VAT register for them until you hit what's called the distance selling regulation, which is about 30,000, 35,000 euros in most countries and 100,000 euros last time I looked in Germany. So that means you can get started pretty easily. Now, obviously, Americans have to VAT register from the off, so that makes the economics a bit harder to make work. So you just need to crunch the numbers.
Yeah, that's the hard part about the UK is that you do have to worry about the margins there, because one of the things that's very different is that the price includes the VAT, basically it's sales tax essentially. Whereas here in the
Exactly.
US, we're just used to, it just adds onto the top and then we just, send it on into the whatever state government later. So yeah, it's definitely
Well, you
different.
say just. I mean, I guess it comes down to familiarity, doesn't it? Because if you are used to the idea
True.
of sales tax in the US, maybe you're not so freaked out for it. But look, I've interviewed two experts on this, one of whom used to be in-house counsel for Microsoft, so a seriously
Mm,
good tax lawyer, and then a pretty sharp accountant CPA, both Americans. And they gave diametrically opposite advice on what you should do about sales tax to the average Amazon seller. And it's seriously, seriously complex and in great flux. So I would argue that, 3, 4 years ago, absolutely what you're saying. I mean, America could be more profitable, more easily, and much simpler. Now, I don't think that's the case because number one, you've got the Trump taxes and maybe 10%, maybe 25% on the import duty side
on the
coming into
tariffs,
America.
yeah.
And then you've got to deal with the sales tax, which is enormously complex. And the cost of complying with it can be way more than the actual cost of the tax. Whereas VAT is relatively straightforward. You pay 20% if you come into the UK, which is what I'm most familiar with. You pay about 20% on the import side. So if you land something for $5 landed cost, so that would be say $4 manufacture, $1 freight, and let's say you don't have any insurance on top, plus a bit of import duty. So all of that added together, you just add 20%, and that's VAT. You give it to the tax man here. And then when you sell it for, say, I don't know, $20 equivalent, or, 15, £16,
Hmm.
you just add 20% onto the selling price, and that money you give back to the taxman as well. And then you get a rebate on the import side. So it's unfamiliar, therefore complicated, but it's actually not anything like as complex as the situation you have in the States now. Not a few years ago, but now the import duty side and the sales tax side are real complex. So if you're American, Britain's going to be simpler than that, and most of Europe. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be a walk in the park, but it's going to be simpler. It's much easier to get a definitive, simple, very stable ruling from an accountant here than you can get from a sales tax expert in the US, right? Because sales tax is mutating like a virus every 2 months, as I perceive it.
That's so true. And I think you hit it on the nail on the head, as we would say, that the just is a lot of times just our comfort level. Our comfort
Yes.
level is what we're used to. And to your point, there's in the US 44, 45-ish states that have a sales tax. I forget the exact number. And they all have wildly different rules.
Mm.
Whereas at least when you go into like VAT countries like in the EU or GST, HST in Canada, you start finding it's like at a federal government level. So it's the
Mm.
main government. You're not having to worry about every county, every province.
Yeah.
Fill out a sales tax return for the state of Texas.
Mm.
It's in very crazy if you try to figure it out on your own
Yeah.
without some sort of software tool or someone to do it for you. Whereas once you start learning like VAT and how it works, it's not that complex.
No, it really
You
isn't.
have to learn it, but it's like
Yeah.
anything. The first time you do it, you're not going to understand it.
Absolutely right. That's the thing. I mean, The main barrier to doing anything in a foreign culture, whether it be a foreign business culture, so
Hmm.
VAT as opposed to sales tax, or German as opposed to English, and I've lived in Germany for a couple of years in my 20s, so I'm familiar with being in a different country, a different culture,
Hmm.
is that you have to be willing to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. So you have to be willing to go, this is unfamiliar,
Hmm.
and therefore it doesn't feel quote normal or natural or whatever word you
Right.
might use. But actually it will once you've got used to it. It's just a question of accepting that you're in unfamiliar territory. Be wise and humble about that. To be humble enough to ask for help,
Hmm.
and be wise about the fact that you shouldn't invest, your nest egg for retirement in something when you don't know what you're doing yet. But that's true if you're starting off selling on Amazon from scratch. If you're based in the US, sourcing in the US, selling in the US, it's
Hmm.
still an unfamiliar territory. So be humble and don't put all of your money in. Start exactly as you did with some retail arbitrage. And I would say the same thing applies to Europe. Like, number one, accept that it's different. So you're going to have a level of comfort zone. You're outside. That's okay. Number one, get some training. Number two, get experts involved where they're needed. But like I said, the expertise needed to negotiate sales tax is like, to my mind, literally 100 times more than the expertise for VAT, because people have been doing VAT for decades and it hasn't really changed much. Where sales tax is changing by literally the month, because half the, as I understand it, this is a Brit talking to American, so bringing coals to Newcastle, as we say. Um,
Hmm.
but it seems like half of them are moving over to marketplace law, which means that they make Amazon or eBay, the states make those responsible for collecting sales
Makes it
tax,
so much
and then
easier.
half of them aren't. Like VAT, like, okay, you add 20% to your import, you pay it to whoever, you pay it normally via DHL or UPS, whoever's
Right.
doing
And they
it,
figure it
and
out
that's dealt
for
with.
you. It's
It's
not
dealt
like
with.
you have
It's
to
not that
figure it out. They
complex.
just say, here's the
No.
bill.
And listen, you've got one government in the UK. We don't have states. It's not a federal structure. And
Hmm.
Germany is technically a federal structure, actually 16 states. But basically, most stuff seems to go via central government. I mean, so it's just
Right.
a much simpler system. It's not that complex. It's unfamiliar. So number one, get training. Number two, get an expert. And number three, start small. Make your mistakes on a small scale, and you'll be fine. I mean, it's really, the other thing is, if there's a barrier to entry and it's mostly in people's heads, mostly, not all, but mostly, then that's good, because most people will give up. And if you don't, then there are fewer people competing with you on the other side, which is great. So there's a great reasons for doing it. If there's a barrier and it's not that big, but people think it's big, that's kind of a great sign of value, if you like.
Yeah, that's so true. Because the thing of it is the good stuff in life is always on the other side of being uncomfortable. Whether
Normally,
that's in
yes.
business or just in personal life. I wouldn't have my children that I have today if I didn't ask my wife to marry me. And that was nerve wracking. And like, what are her parents going to say before? And I asked them beforehand, like just little things like that. And it's like, you start looking back in regret on the chances you didn't take because you gave in to the uncomfortable. Or at
Mm.
least I know I look back on quite a few things that way. Whereas, the things that I actually went for might have been uncomfortable, or like there was some fear, but once you step aside that and you go past it, then like you realize, oh, it wasn't that bad, and that's where the good stuff in life is.
I agree, although I nuance that a bit. I mean, there's a fantastic, fantastic book by Jim Collins, who wrote lots of things like Good to Great, Great by
Hmm.
Choice. Great by Choice is a very, very good book because it deals with people who built businesses in an environment of great uncertainty, and it contrasts to sort of contrasting companies. And they're big corporate level companies, so it's not an ideal sort of scenario to exactly learn from for a very small business owner or somebody who's scaling up a small
Sure.
business fast. But the basics are right. And one of the principles, he says, fire bullets, then fire cannonballs. So I wouldn't say you should
I
plunge in
like
with
that.
massive risk, because
I
if you
agree.
go in and you only have $10,000 in your savings account, and that's what you spend on your first launch into the UK, and it goes a bit wrong, then that hasn't been a good experience, and you may regret that, and you may regret the fact that you didn't have the money to put towards property deposit or whatever it is in your life. But if you go in with a small test order, and you test the market, and you test your competence, and you test the competence of your suppliers, you test everything, then you're being professional about it. So you're not being scared off, nor are you plunging in like a gambler. So in the end, it comes down to, don't be scaredy cat sitting on the edge doing nothing. That's what most people do.
Hmm.
Occasionally people plunge in the opposite side, and I've seen this with working with people from scratch for 3.5 years now. Of the opposite side, so I had one person, a member of again an early version of a mastermind, which was kind of a sharing of ignorance mostly, but a few people took action. And he literally went to the Canton Fair and bought a container load of products with no product research,
Oh
which kind of
wow.
sounds insane. Well, it actually
Oh
happened, and
my
he shared the
gosh.
details. And of course, it didn't work very well, but I kind of admired that. But in the end, it's a question of calculated risk. But
Right.
but not just calculated. The nuance from Jim Collins is calculate the risk and then be humble enough to know your calculations may be slightly off. So you fire the bullets from a sailing from one of those galleons back in the 18th century sea battles,
Right,
and your
right.
bullets are slightly off course. So you correct course to the left, slightly too far to the left, correct course slightly far up, correct course again, bang, it hits. Okay, now you fire your cannonballs. And I think that's just simple humility that some people try and bypass by having a magic guru or course that's going to give you the magic answer, predicting perfectly, which is extremely hard to do, or they just realize they can't guarantee the outcome and they think that they have to be all or nothing and therefore they freeze. And there's a certain logic to freezing in that situation. But the answer is test as small as you can get away with and then scale up when it works and if it works and when it works and scale up your winners. Double or
Yeah.
quits is another way of putting it. you know?
Makes so much sense because it's kind of like swimming. Like, you know, you'll never understand what it's like to swim until you jump in the pool,
Yeah.
but don't jump into like the middle of the ocean with crazy waves in the middle of a storm. You
Yes.
know, you can
Not
maybe
the
do
way
that
to learn
one
to swim.
day, but
Yeah.
move your way
Yeah.
up to that.
Yeah, exactly. Start in the shallow end, put your armbands on. And for me, that for Amazon selling of any kind, it would be retail arbitrage, I guess, or something like it, online arbitrage. It doesn't really matter for me whether you make profit or not if you're not planning that as your main business model. It's training. I didn't learn to swim with armbands on so that I could get good at swimming with armbands on. I put
Sure.
the armbands on so I didn't sink whilst I learned to keep myself afloat. And then I took the armbands off and then got on with it. And that's kind of more or less how I approach these things now. And the same is true for the UK. If
Mhm.
you want to sell in the UK, listen. If you're an American that's already selling in the US, here's what I would do. I would number one, get some training. Number two, get an accountant. And there are loads. Every accountant in Britain should be able to handle
Oh
VAT.
yeah.
Um, I mean, yes, okay, e-commerce, you might get a specialist in that, but there are enough of those around now, and you could always get in touch with somebody like me, or get some recommendations. But I
Mhm.
would say if you're having 1,000 units made in China every 3 months to ship over to the States, then just ship 100 more over by air to the UK, get yourself VAT registered, and see if you can get some traction here. Do a bit of fresh keyword research, but the risk isn't that huge because you're getting the stuff made anyway.
Right.
If you want to zero the risk down, then you basically spend minimum money on the VAT registration side. You get 1,000 units made, and you don't get any extra units made. You just shift 100 of them. You just point them from your supplier to the UK as opposed to the US.
Absolutely.
It's not
Absolutely.
that
You don't
big a
even have
deal.
to order more units
No,
theoretically.
not really. No,
Because
and
at
it's
the
the
end of the
latest test.
day,
Yeah,
yeah, as you're turning through your inventory in the US, there's a certain portion that's going to be just sitting on a shelf for
yeah,
however long it's going to sit there. So
exactly,
just
exactly.
instead of move it from the back of the line, so to speak, to the front of the line in Europe.
Yeah,
So yeah, you could totally start out with small amounts just to get some data. So what are some differences that you notice between the US and the UK and just maybe how customers are or what works and what doesn't work, outside of like VAT and sales tax?
yeah. I think the main characteristic is that American markets are just bigger, so that has
Mm.
two side effects. Well, not side effects, two effects.
Hmm.
One is that if you're after a keyword that is too broad, you're going to need to have $50,000 to $100,000 in your back pocket to even compete and launch in that marketplace. It's very easily the numbers get a bit scary for people who are newcomers, or even a business that hasn't got very major capital. Um, By the same token, you can get things to work there that wouldn't work in the UK. As an example, I sold music stand lights there, which had just batteries, AAA batteries, or whatever they're called in
Okay.
the States. And they did okay in the States, but it got very competitive because it wasn't niched down enough. So everyone was selling the same
Mm.
thing. And then I sold rechargeable music stand lights. Now, in the UK, I ended up with rechargeable music stand lights that ranked, I think, number two, number three for the keyword music, rechargeable music stand lights. So it's quite niche, or rechargeable stand lights, but they sold like one or two a day. And in America, when I got to that position, it was about 10 units a day, and coming into Q4, sometimes it was 40, 50, and on Cyber Monday once did 100. So it's really, it works in a different way. I mean, I would say in America, you need to be more skilled at niching down. In other words, finding more sort of hidden value niches. Um, Whereas in Europe, you can sort of niche back up almost. So if you've
Sure.
been selling in the States, You might want to consider fractionally broader market in the UK or Germany. It just depends on the numbers in each case, really.
And sometimes that could just be positioning of the product too. And the nice thing is, to your point, like you can go broader because it's not as competitive. And I think a lot of it is a function of people just don't want to jump through the hoops. Like they're more likely to say, I'm going to spend all this time figuring out eBay or Shopify when they
Yeah.
could just go into Europe and Canada and do more than they would probably do in, eBay and Shopify combined
Yeah,
without
I mean,
having to learn new platforms.
exactly. I mean, it depends on what you want to be doing in the future, but I mean, broadly speaking, yeah. I mean, why not take the low-hanging fruit? Here's the thing, as we've hinted at with what we were saying earlier, if you order, say, if your minimum order quantity is 1,000 units a month, sorry, 1,000 units per order, and
Mm-hmm.
you're only selling in the States, say, 250 units a month, you've got about 4 months worth of inventory. Now, you
Right.
might want to order a bit more, have some safety stock and all the rest, but
Mm-hmm.
essentially, your inventory performance index, which is how Amazon measures whether they like you storing your stuff in
Right.
their warehouses because they're going to turn it over quickly and make money, or whether you're taking up valuable space somebody else could be having, they'll start penalizing it if you basically have inventory for more than 3 months in their
Mm-hmm.
FCs, in the fulfillment centers. So you might want to have some stock in a 3PL, a third party warehouse or something. But essentially, you want to go for 3 months worth of stock in an actual FC, right? So if you're selling 200 units a month in the States and you've got 1,000 MOQ, that's not a great relationship. But what you can do is ship some over to the UK, and if you manage to sell, say, 50 a month more in the UK and 50 in Germany, suddenly you've only got just over 3 months worth of stock. So that
Right.
relationship between the minimum bulk that you have to order and the amount that you can move through the system profitably really can change a lot. I mean, all you need to do is, I would suggest, UK is an easy starting point. Germany, you can fulfill from the UK using your European fulfillment network. So it's not really that much of a bigger deal, and you'd have to talk to experts in how to do that from the US. Japan's more of a
It's
difficulty.
actually very simple to do what you're just
Yeah.
talking about there.
Well, there
Yeah.
you go. I mean, and the Japan is literally 2 weeks by sea, door to door from the East Coast factories, which is where the majority of stuff is made in China,
Mm-hmm.
to an Amazon fulfillment center in Japan. And the size of the market is only um, smaller than Germany. It's about the same or bigger at the moment than the UK. And yeah, you've got some cultural differences to overcome, but as a barrier to entry, in a very, very valuable market. It's not like Canada. It's not like, 10th the size of the US or something. It's actually pretty substantial. And I don't know the absolute figures that from the last 12 months or so, but if you go back to, say, 2016, the numbers that spring to mind, and I think the US did about 90 to $100 billion. Germany was 14 billion. UK was about 11, and Japan was about 11. So in other words, it's substantial money being made there, and there's a barrier to entry. But yes, you got cultural problems. Yes, you got to get somebody on the ground to deal with it. But that's easily dealt with. You just hire somebody for it. But the shipping time of 2 weeks, I mean, like, you can't really beat that.
True.
That lowers that risk considerably, because if you need to restock, okay, you got your manufacturing lead time, but the shipping lead time's almost nothing. So that really can simplify a lot of stuff. And if you can add another, 50 to 100 unit sales a month, you can suddenly make a product viable as a whole, in terms of you produce this amount and you sell it through in a certain amount of time. If you start selling internationally, it very quickly becomes viable when it wouldn't have been if you're just selling the US. And if your competitors aren't doing that, you can basically sell a product that they couldn't make the economics of it work. So there's a lot of power in that. I mean, the main thing is this. We talked before about, if somebody is seeing a barrier and it's not actually that real, or they're perceiving the
Mm.
difficulty as a level 10 and it's actually level 3, and you overcome that, then you beat the people who forget how painful it is to find a good supplier. I mean, to get a product produced at the requisite quality in a decent time frame and at a profitable level of price is super hard, I think. I mean, I find that hard, and it's time consuming even for people who are very good at it. It's very time consuming. Um, so that's the hard bit. Once you've got a supplier that works at a product that's good quality and you can buy it at a good price, turning on Amazon marketplaces is somewhat more work, but it's like another 20% more work. Whereas getting another supplier for a new product line is 100% more work, in my experience, my opinion.
Well, right, and you don't know if that new product line is going to work and things of that
Absolutely.
nature. Whereas,
Yeah.
if you see, let's say you're selling yoga mats and or garlic presses. I'm trying to think of something generic.
Yeah.
And then, like, if similar yoga mats and similar garlic presses are selling in Canada, it's worth at least trying, or UK or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, like
absolutely.
Japan, I think is kind of what we were talking about with swimming. It's like the open ocean where it's a little bit more open waters you can build up to. But I
Yeah,
always,
maybe. But here's the thing. I mean, like I have to say, first of all, cards on the table. I'm not selling in Japan at the moment. I definitely hungry to try it out. But there's a guy that I know, John Cant, who is British based, and his wife is Japanese. He's lived out there, so he's the person who can handle it, and he's helping lots of sellers launch there.
oh,
So
that's
I
cool.
trust him. I know he knows his business. He's helped lots of people do it. He's a straightforward guy. If I were going to do it, I'd say, okay, you deal with that stuff, and there'll be mess ups. But look, the question is not will it work? The question is how big is the risk versus the potential reward for me?
That's a good
The risk
question
is
to ask.
minimal. If I'm just getting another 100 units made, or if
Hmm.
I'm getting 1,000 units made and I'm selling, maybe 800 per 3 months in the States, I can afford to put a couple of hundred units towards something else. If I ship it into Japan, the wonderful thing, you see, this is the difference. The wonderful thing for me is there's a barrier to entry, but I can phone the guy and he takes care of it for a bit of money.
Hmm.
So I got to risk the money that I spend this guy and a bit on the products, which I'm getting made anyway. So the only extra risk for me is a bit more money to ship it to Japan, and it might sit there for 6 months or a year or whatever. Big deal.
Hmm.
But the other great thing about it is you can't use Jungle Scout there. And like I hate to break it to everyone, but it's 2019. All the big East Coast factories, there are about 60 factories that have literally thousands of employees each. I remember talking to Kevin King about this a while ago. And they are using Jungle Scout the whole time in the US and probably Europe. Jungle Scout doesn't work yet in Japan as at the time of this recording that I know of. So that means you're
Yeah, I'm
driving
pretty sure
blind,
you're right.
which means you have to be a grown-up entrepreneur and actually experiment. But experiment with 100 units, not your life savings, not a
Right,
thousand, not
right,
a new
right.
product, a
You
proven
don't have to
product,
do a
a
whole
proven
different
supplier.
MOQ just for another
Everything, yeah,
country.
exactly. You just say to the same supplier, okay, I want you to put 100 units aside in, I don't know what, 2 boxes, 2 cartons. It might be 2 shipping cartons. That's what we're talking about for the average size widget. Who knows?
Hmm.
But don't do it with a widget that costs like, $100 each to make. I mean, it's unlikely, but do it with something that's cheap. And if it sits there for ages and doesn't sell or gets snagged up in customs for a couple of months, okay. But you know what? Just because you're American doesn't mean that the American customs authorities is going to be any nicer to you than anybody else. Again, the biggest issues I've seen in the world that with Amazon sellers is that I've had stuff get tied up by UK customs for a few days, sometimes a week, but US customs occasionally will just say, okay, we're going to strip this container down and we're going to force everybody to inspect. We're going to inspect it. We're going to delay it by crazy. And by the way, you have to pay for the inspection. That's grim. I mean, the worst case scenario in any other country is probably not worse than that. Just because it's comfortable and familiar doesn't mean you're not in danger. Just because I'm used to living in London and I might be around the corner
Mm.
from my house doesn't mean I'm not in danger. It's a dangerous city. Home doesn't mean safety automatically. And particularly for Americans, I mean, American importing regulations and regulators are tough. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you should put Japan into context and say it ain't that scary if you got a competent person on your side. You just have to
But
rely on experts.
that's so true because, like, and I say Japan is very advanced for international, but to your point, it's one of those things where if you look at the risk versus reward, what's the
Exactly.
worst that would actually happen?
Yeah.
Don't order a whole new MOQ just for that. Take one and split it up. I mean, try
Yep.
different things. The people that try different things are the ones that tend to succeed more in the long term.
Yeah. But I mean, honestly, people worry. Here's the essence of what we're dealing with here. And I struggle with it. Like, I want certainty, I guess, at some level, but I also like uncertainty. And I guess that's why I'm an entrepreneur. I actually kind of actively like it, which is a bit weird, but I'm not sure my wife's always delighted about that, but she's kind of coming to terms with who I am, I guess. But here's the thing. If you crave certainty, you should definitely not go into Japan. But where there's uncertainty, but very low risk and big potential upside, it makes sense to take the play. And like the worst case scenario is very low as far as I'm concerned in that situation. So I would take the play. I mean, and I have to say, hand on heart, haven't done Japan yet. Whatever reason, just didn't get round to it. Someone had a really, product that was thought was even worth pursuing that way. But definitely going to America from the UK felt bit of a big leap, and it surely was. And I've learned things about the American customs authorities, and now I know why you need a customs broker. And I've had my shipments, stuck for 2-3 weeks, and we get these things. But in the
Sure.
end, all of life's a risk anyway. So it's not a question of not having risk. It's a question of where's the risk reward ratio, and where also are you taking small risk when you don't know what you're doing yet, the fire bullets and then cannibals thing.
I
So
like that.
as long as you follow those two basic principles, I don't think you go far wrong. And I think like one of the characteristics of the people in the masterminds that I run that are doing really, really well is that they are willing to take risks, but they are calculated risks. They're not gamblers, because you tend to lose all your money and you don't have anything left to play with, or you lose the company. And when you've got a company employing lots of people and doing, 8 figures a year, that's a serious business. In a couple of cases, we've got people who got family businesses that have been in their family for generations, and that's not so uncommon with small businesses, especially if they're moving into the online space from an established physical bricks and mortar retail. That's not uncommon. That's a responsibility. So it's not a question of being a ridiculous gambler, but it's not a question of sitting on the side being totally risk averse, because the biggest risk in a very, very active marketplace like Amazon is doing nothing. Because if your competition is going ahead of you and you're not, you're going to lose market share to them. Even if you started off with a winning proposition, you're going to lose anyway, because they're going to control the market. They'll turn the price against you. They'll advertise you out of existence. Broadly speaking, you have to have a certain degree of calculated risk taking if the other competition is doing the same as you, in my experience.
That's a good point. It's a good point. You kind of have to stay ahead of the competition there.
You have to. I mean, yeah, it's not an option on Amazon. You can't just be static. That is not the nature of the place,
Gotcha. So from your experience and what you're seeing, what's working right now?
Right. So I can give you a sort of more topical tidbit, but
Sure.
I think what's
Whatever
working
direction.
now is what's working now is what's worked for decades in Amazon and off Amazon. There's a book called The Star Principle by Richard Koch, which I'm always banging on about, because it seems to me so incredibly precisely to describe the Amazon businesses, particularly the ones I know up close.
Is it about Amazon, or is it just in general?
Not at all. No, it's general.
Okay.
I mean, Richard Koch is one of those people that he was a management consultant in, I think, McKinsey's or somebody like that. Then he worked for Bain and Company when they broke away, and the Boston Consulting Group. And the Boston Consulting Group came up with this thing called the Matrix, which basically said, okay, if you want to know if you get a business or a product line, and this is the bit that's 100% relevant for Amazon, that is going to be valuable in the future, it only needs to tick 2 boxes, right? There's a 2x2 grid, beloved of all management consultants.
Okay.
And that is, it needs to be in a fast growing market, so growing at least 10% a year, which on Amazon is slow growth. I mean, so many markets for weird widgets that last year nobody had ever heard of. This year, suddenly everyone's selling yerba matcha bowls or something, and it's become the latest thing. And the other thing about the Star business is that it has to be the leader. And what does that mean? It means it has to, by a substantial margin, preferably a lot, be getting a bigger market share percentage. And you just measure it by revenue. So if you look on Amazon, this translates incredibly directly if you use a tool, like Jungle Scout, Helium 10, Viral Launch, or the big ones that I've used. You can look and say, okay, the first couple of pages, so roughly speaking, this kind of market is worth about $100,000 a month in revenue. And that's very approximate, but let's just take that approximation. If you could be the guy doing $30,000 of that revenue, and the nearest competitor is doing 15,000, you have an incredibly valuable product. And here's simply why it works. And by the way, this is theory. A few years ago, I read the book. I thought, this sounds amazing. And I've seen that it describes precisely what all the bestsellers in the mastermind are doing. Not just one or two. All the products that are working follow this, and all the products that are struggling generally don't. Because what happens is this: number one, you got the social proof of being top of your game, top of the listing results. Number two, you get more reviews and more social proof, because you're selling more, so you get more reviews. So that means you've got the social proof of the reviews and your ranking of being more popular. You can get a slightly better selling price. You can sell at a higher price. The other side of it is that because you're doing more bulk, you can go back to your supplier and get better supplier terms, so better cash flow, and you can get better price normally, because if you're ordering bigger quantities, you get a somewhat lower cost per unit. In China, I find there isn't a violent difference, but it all helps. So those two factors both push towards you getting more profit. If you've got more profit and you have somebody else come into the marketplace to try and sell it at a lower price or advertising, guess what? You've got more money in your bank than anybody else in that niche, all things being equal. Now, it depends who you're competing with and how serious they are, but all things being equal, to spend more money on advertising or reduce your price to starve them out of the market. So there's so many reasons why it works, but it just does. I mean, the people who are killing it and doubled their business, in one case twice, in the time they've been with me, so 2 years now, absolutely dominate things like, certain keywords. I'm not going to reveal what they are, but
Sure,
let's
sure,
say,
sure.
and they're position 1, they're position 3, they're position 4, and they are killing that marketplace. They dominate it, and it's very profitable.
Okay,
And
so
that's how it works for me. That's what I've seen really, really working.
nice. So what are some things that like someone listening could do to say, okay, I want to, whether they're in like that big of a market or one that's maybe not quite there, but like there's, I'm sure, some principles that can be applied
Yeah, it's
on
very, very
scaling and
simple.
growing.
Yeah, I can tell you. And it's so flipping simple. It sounds ridiculously simple. It sounds like, yeah, anyone could say that. That's nice to have. But,
Oh, I can't
and I'm here
wait.
to say, all you got to do is this, right? Do not ever enter a fight you can't win. So
Mm.
don't go into any market where you couldn't potentially at least become the dominant player in that market. And look, it might be $5,000 a month market.
Hmm.
But you're better off dominating a $5,000 a month market than you are being a small piece of $1 million a month market. And that's very counterintuitive. And it's hard to actually do or get your head around. Intellectually, it's very,
Hmm.
very simple, right? We can say, yeah, I get it. But to actually follow up on that is harder,
Mm.
because people are tempted, because nobody wants that crickets thing where you sit there and nobody's buying anything. And of
Right.
course you want demand. But if you can't dominate a market on Amazon, sooner or later, and sooner is what, you know how it goes. You sell on Amazon. It's within 6 to 12 months, maybe 18, there's going to be a price war. And if you're not setting the prices because you're the dominant player or one of the really dominant players, you lose out. You may make sales, you may not, but you won't make profit. And profit comes from this, having a higher selling price and a lower cost base per unit, or a lower unit cost, right? And that comes from premium positioning and a better cost base because you're ordering more stuff. It's kind of brutally simple. Like, if you cannot dominate a market, you have no business going in my opinion, period. So if you've got £5,000 in your pocket, or $6,000 or something, you're insane to go into a market where you need 50, because you will just be on page 3, or even if you're on page 1, because you drop the price to the floor, you won't make a profit. And that's how it works. It's brutal. It's winner take all kind of thing. It really is how the internet's going. Google's the same for various reasons I won't get into, but the Amazon is just like this star principle on steroids. So
Right.
go in somewhere you can win, or don't go in. That's very simple, but it sounds so simplistic. But guess what? That rules out 95% of opportunities, which is great, because you don't have to spend much time scratching your head and going, should I do this? The answer is like, no, don't do it. If you can't beat the competition, like, hands down, then just don't bother.
Well, and that's so true, because like let's say someone, they're looking at something that, like, might be more of, like, as we would call, a base hit than a home run or even a
Mm.
bunt, or they're just walked on to the base, so to speak. But at
And
the end of the
listen,
day, they're still
yeah.
getting on base, and so you don't have to go after the home run products.
Yeah, you don't. Well, here's the thing. What do you mean by a home run? This is what I mean. It's the lens you got to look through. It's not about
Perspective.
how much. Yeah, and it's very simple, but it's very different from what most people do, which is probably why Richard Koss got rich from applying something that's been in the management consulting space for 60 years now. It's 50. It's a
Hmm.
very old idea. It's not new. But most people don't do it, because here's the thing: you look at your own life and you say, "Wow, I can make $10,000 a month profit on Amazon," and you see those numbers, and maybe you're making $3,000 a month in your data, and you think, wow, that's a lot of money. But that's the wrong relative. Everything's relative, but it's not relative to you.
Mm.
It's not about sales either. It's about market share. If your competitors are doing $100,000 a month and you're doing 30, you're at grave risk, because they control the market. If they decide to move the price down, you can't afford to wait them out. They've got more money than you. They can starve you out. Whereas if you're doing $10,000 a month and the next guy is like 3,000, you control that market. It's not as many sales, but that's
Hmm.
okay. If you want more sales, launch another product in the same niche, or another one you can dominate. So, you know, I can't stress enough how true I've seen this to be. I mean, it's my view. I'm not saying that everyone in the mastermind would articulate this the same way, but it's my view of what they're doing. But nevertheless, it's not subtle to me. I mean, like, there are people who are doing about $1 million a year run rate, and they're struggling for profit because they're in big markets and they're constantly fighting on price, because they
Mm.
don't dominate. They're good and they're quite high up, but they don't dominate. And there's all the difference in the world. Um, it's a bit like that old sort of I would say mafia. That sounds like a terrible business reference. But if you control the street where you sell, I don't know, stuff from the butcher's shop in Little Italy or whatever, and this is well outside my cultural references, so what do I know? This is all from movies. I have no idea. But you know,
I think we can
you
follow
control the
you.
street. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. And like it sounds ridiculously simplistic, but I promise those are the guys making the profit. And the other guys, just like they're super clever and they're working incredibly hard, but they're struggling for profit. Even though their sales volume is good and their product's beautiful and they've worked on that and they've done everything else right, they're still struggling for profit. And the people who dominate strange little markets that most of us never heard of, and they're not necessarily that little, but they're not mass markets, they're making great profits. You know, it's kind of that black and white to me. I mean, it's crazy how obvious it is. It's like an open secret to me. But there you go. It's my view.
There you go. Good deal. So on the flip side, and this might feed into it, or maybe this might be something completely different. What is it you're saying is not working today? Maybe it did work before, but you're saying it's not working anymore.
Gosh, well, there's a long list. It depends how it depends how naive you're being or how badly informed you are. I mean, the first thing that you should never do, but people still do, and it blows my mind, is ask for an incentivized review in a way that Amazon can track. So if you say something like, this is why this is mind-blowingly bad, because the downside of it is huge. You can get your account suspended. It's not theoretical. I know several people personally whose accounts have been suspended, and a couple of them I put them in touch with lawyers, and they got them back up, which is great, or whoever's going to deal with it. But don't ever say something like, if you enjoyed your experience, or if you had a good experience, or don't even use the words good experience, by the way. The algorithm's now picking up on this. Don't say something like, if you had a good experience, leave us a positive review. If you had a bad experience, or leave us a review. And if you had a bad experience, get in touch with us, because it's obviously trying to prevent negative reviews appearing. And since October 2016, to be precise, that's a terrible idea. And the downside is massive. So never do that. That's one thing that isn't working. Another thing that isn't working is, as I said, like kind of close following a competitor, rather than trying to dominate. Doesn't work very well. What really works incredibly badly is putting up the same exact physical product design as everybody else and expecting to have a price difference. It'll sell for the same kind of price. And the other thing is about that, there's no such thing as a generic product. Somebody somewhere created the product design. So whether they actually applied for a patent or not, there's some kind of intellectual property rights, either through common law usage in the US and the UK, or through actual applications for a patent. So that's a very risky strategy. And I say this is somebody who ordered something that I thought was a generic product, and I got 3 years sales out of it or whatever. And then the rights owner got in touch and said, okay, you need to stop selling this product because we have the patent on this. And they showed that I got the Google design number, and I looked at it and I looked at my product. I'm like, yes, you got me banged to rights. I can't claim that it isn't the same. So fortunately, I didn't have that many units. But that, yes, so copying is very bad practice for intellectual property risk, and it's very bad practice for marketing. So your product must look different from every other product on page one for the search results for the main keywords you're going after. That's the other thing, differentiation, right? You absolutely have to do it from a marketing point of view, and it's very wise to do it from an intellectual property point of view as well.
Yeah, and there has to be something that differentiates your product. I mean, 100%. Otherwise, you know, absolutely. why would someone buy yours over something else when it's like literally the same thing?
Amazon, I tell you, there's again the nasty truth that people don't like about Amazon. But Jeff Bezos, again, another open secret. Jeff Bezos has said as his strategy, it's a funny sort of word that people get confused about. But the STAR principle is a strategic principle, for example, but it shows up very simply in day-to-day stuff. The other principles, the customer-centric thing that Jeff Bezos talks about, customers are going to want, he's been saying this for years, decades, they're going to want greater selection, lower prices, faster delivery. Now, faster delivery, Amazon works on, and that's great for us as sellers because people love buying stuff. Sure. Lower prices ain't great for us. More selection means more competition. There is always a price competition on Amazon. The default position on Amazon is people will buy it because it's cheaper and it looks about the same, plus it has about the same number of stars. And you've got to fight to everything you can to get out of that. Do not be compared like for like. You don't want apples to apples comparisons. So that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and if you're going to be an Apple, you want to be a more premium type of Apple. You don't want to be the red Apple.
Yeah,
maybe you want to be the Granny Smith. I don't know if that's more
true.
Expensive.
No, you're absolutely right. But the danger with the premium positioning idea is that, of course, you should position yourself as premium, but you've got to be very, very careful because most of the time, if you add more features, it's going to cost you more money. and the Amazon buyer is probably not going to pay more than a fraction more. So if you can sell a widget for $19.99, and that's what your competition's doing, and you want to sell a widget for $25, you think, and you add another, you say $6 to your cost price, well, okay, you might say you could just about get that back. The trouble is the Amazon consumer doesn't care about your costs. They just want a better product for nearly the same money. So you might sell it for $21.99, but you probably won't sell it for $25, in my experience. So you have to be enormously, enormously careful not to add to your costs when you're differentiating a product. Otherwise, again, you will make sales, but not at a profitable price. I mean, you can put the price at anything you want, but if you price it at $25 and you're selling, 20 units a month, but the minimum order quantity is 2,000, you've now got 100 months worth of stock, and that's not going to work, is it? It's going to starve to death. So the premium pricing thing is a risky play. A lot of people, in my experience working with new people particularly, are incredibly optimistic about how much you can overprice stuff on Amazon. It's a very price sensitive marketplace, which isn't to say you can't get premium positioning, but you just have to look at the relationship between the increase in your costs and the selling price and be very realistic about it. Because the price you can sell something for is speculation before you launched, whereas your costs are for sure. They're definite. You've paid them before you launch. So you need to always watch the cost price side.
Okay, good deal. All right, so here's an interesting question. So we'll kind of wrap this up here, but you've mentioned several books. So clearly you're someone who's very astute on different books. If someone was, let's say, they came to you and they said, "Hey, I'm selling about $100,000 a year, whatever the case is, and I'm looking to scale up." What book, and it could be one you mentioned or one you haven't, what book would you recommend to them?
Well, I'd require everyone who almost making it requirements for the 10K Collective Mastermind to read the STAR Principle. I'm that serious about it. But apart from that, if they're scaling fast, there's a book called Scaling Up by Vern Harnish. That's Verrne, and then Harnish, Harnish. The American guy, they often have unspellable names like mine. So Vern Harnish, Scaling Up, and it is exactly geared to people who are running small and medium businesses and scaling fast. Really fantastic book, and it separates strategy from execution, people skills, your people approach, and then the cash flow management, which is critical with an inventory based business. So that is the perfect book for you if you're at that stage.
Yes, and cash flow is such a big thing that we could make a whole episode just talking about that. It's one of those things you don't quite understand it. It's like swimming. You don't understand it until you're in the water. You don't understand cash flow until you're in the middle of it. Especially we're recording this like in the middle of the holidays, so the cash flow is starting to get to a better position. But it was rough there for a while for a lot of us. But anyway,
around September seems to be the peak cash flow crunch for most people. I think you
exactly, because you're having to put so much out to basically get it back now as we're recording this. So it's
absolutely
it's crazy. But yeah, this has been a great conversation. So if anyone wanted to follow you a little bit more or get in touch with you or just find you on the internet, where would they go to do that?
Well, we're going to set a couple of things up, some value for people, free downloads for people. So that there's two things depending on which situation they're in. For people who are just starting out, if they go to amazingfba.com/Kevin, Kevin for November, in case they're struggling with your name indeed. Then we're going to have the build guide, as we call it. So it's 10 steps to building an Amazon business from scratch based on these kinds of principles. It's a big picture thing. We have other guides that are more precise about product research and so forth as well. But that's a very good start if you're new to the space. And then if you are a more advanced seller, I've got the slides from a recent talk I gave, which is based on the principles that we are seeing working in the mastermind. And at the end of it, there are only about 40, 50 people in the audience. About 3 people came up and said, I would like to join your mastermind. So whatever I said seemed to really resonate. So I think it's going to be worth putting that slideshow out for you. And I'm actually going to have a video being made as well. So I'm happy to send the video of the talk, because I think it did seem to resonate. And again, in the end, feedback from the marketplace is the only thing that matters. So that's why I trust that it has some value, because it seems to have resonated.
Okay, good deal. And then where would they go to get that?
amazingfba.com/Kevin, Kevin for November.
Oh, for both of those?
Yeah, we'll put it in the same place, and then we'll do 2 options. I mean, people can get both if they really want to have everything I've got to offer them. Some people do. That's how it works. And some people consume everything you have.
All right, good deal. And for everybody watching on YouTube, we'll have a link down below. And if anyone's or for those listening on the podcast, we'll have that in the show notes for this particular episode, so they can just go into their podcast player and take a look. And we'll have the the link in there for that as well. But thank you so much, Michael. This has been a fun discussion. It's always good hearing different perspectives, especially when someone's on the other side of the pond looking at it a little differently. It's good to hear what, be kind of the same way we might think, but then also too, it's good to challenge our thoughts as well.
Absolutely. It's been a lot of fun, and thanks for the opportunity to talk it through. It's always fun.
Good deal. Good deal. Thanks, Michael.